Hi everybody. I wanted to make a little video here. It's not a legal video about one of those topics that lawyers might normally talk about, but it's about firearms. And that's because as I've been hanging out at some of the gun shops that I frequent and so forth, the owners have been telling me they've been selling an awful lot of firearms, and a high percentage of those have been to people who haven't owned firearms before. Now, firearm ownership is great. The shooting sports are great. Self-defense is your right. But it's really helpful if you buy a firearm that you have a little bit of basic knowledge about it. And what I find is lots of times people who just have their first firearm kind of are shy about asking basic questions. It's because most of us are afraid we're going to sound foolish or this is something other people are going to say we should know. And we're just not ready to ask questions that we feel like are very basic, even though we may not know the answer to them. Well, that's just foolish. No one's going to make fun of you because you haven't experienced something. None of us have any experience doing something until we do it. It doesn't matter how smart we are. If we haven't done it, haven't had any instruction on it, we don't know, right? So I think it's important to just get started off here and ask people that you know that have a lot of firearms experience and see what they have to say. Now I'm going to show a couple of real basic things here because I think it's important for people to know. Everybody in the firearms sport out there has an opinion. It's just one of those things about what's the best caliber, what's the best type of firearm, who makes the best firearm, all this kind of stuff, how to use it, how to do that. So there's always going to be a difference of opinion on things. Our purpose here is just to go through it to try and show people the differences and highlight a couple of points because I think it'll make me feel better and hopefully it will be a little helpful to folks. First of all, there's two major types of handguns, and handguns that we're talking about here. These are revolvers and semi-automatics. All right. A revolver is something you're usually pretty familiar with, right? It is just that. It has a cylinder in it, and the cylinder revolves. That's where it gets its name. What happens is the rounds are inserted in here, right? A round has a bullet and a casing, and there's a primer in it, and the primer has an explosive powder in it. When it's hit by the firing pin, it creates a spark, ignites the powder, and the bullet is ejected from the firearm, comes out the barrel. The casing is left behind. So that's called a round, and the bullet is what comes out. So with a revolver, and you can see this is a cylinder. One of the things about a revolver that's nice, especially when you're learning, is that they're much easier to operate, and they're easier to see what might be going on. In other words, are they loaded? Are they ready to fire? What's going on? Because you're able to see in them. Now, the cylinder in this, and I see I've got it the wrong way, the cylinder right here is where the rounds go. And in most revolvers, unless they're small caliber and there's more room here, it's usually 6 or 7, just like the old 6-shooters. Now, the safest way to have one of these is with the revolving cylinder out, right? There's a little catch here on the side that allows that to drop forward so you can load it. If it's open like this, there's no way the firearm can go off. And the first thing you got to realize anytime you handle a firearm is to make sure it's unloaded. Even if someone tells you it's unloaded, take a look, because there's a lot of people who've been accidentally shot with firearms that everybody else thought was unloaded. So always verify that for yourself. And with this, you can do that. But always treat the firearm like it is loaded, even if you know it's not, because it's good practice. And once the rounds are in here, you would close this up, and it's ready to fire. Now, a revolver fires with pressure on this trigger. Now, if it's a single action, they call it, revolver, that's like a cowboy type gun that you see where you have to manually pull the hammer back, and then you pull the trigger, and it lets the hammer fall forward. Firearms most of you would be buying are what we call double action firearms. And that is that the trigger here is what pulls the hammer back. It's got a spring in it and an action that catches in there, uses the power from your finger to pull this hammer back, and when the hammer falls, it makes contact with the primer. Bullet comes flying out the end. You can also fire one of these by cocking it yourself, and you'll notice that the trigger now doesn't need all that pressure on it. It's much more sensitive. People do that so that they can have a very, very steady aim with the firearm and not be pulling the trigger hard back, which sometimes can move the sights around. Okay? But most of the time, people are going to be doing it with the pressure from their finger. That's a revolver, and that's usually how it's taken care of, loaded, and so forth. The other one, and a lot of people buy these, I think the revolver is easier to use, it's easier to teach people to shoot, and it's easier to tell whether or not it's loaded. Also, there's some like an innate safety feature about the rounds. If you happen to get a bad round in there, like one that doesn't go off or something, you just pull the trigger again, and the next round rotates in the revolver up to be shot again. A semi-automatic, and we say that because a semi-automatic simply means that every time you pull the trigger, it fires. A fully automatic firearm is one that when you hold the trigger down, it just continues to fire. And those require very special restrictions in order to own them. You have to get a tax stamp and go through an application process with the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms people. So when it's people on the news tell you that someone had an automatic, 90% of the time or more, they mean semi-automatic. Okay. Now the difference between a semi-automatic and revolver or something is pretty obvious. First off, it's much more of a black box, right? Now I realize this isn't black, but I mean is that things happen inside of it and you can't see. And so it's always even more important, if that's possible, to make sure there are no rounds in it. That's because now I have this open all the way, right? This is called the slide. And you can see in it, and you can see that there's no round in there, right? You can see the barrel and nothing's in there, okay? But if it were closed up, you don't know. You can't see in there, and it might have one. Now, this is a magazine. Some people that don't know as much about firearms will tell you that these things take clips. That's not true. A clip is an entirely different thing, usually associated with rifles and, it doesn't have to do with handguns. This is a magazine, meaning you load stuff in it and it carries it, right? So you put the rounds in here. They stack up. There's a spring at the bottom, so it keeps pushing one to the very top. When you put this into the firearm, you slide it up, click shut, and what happens then, there's going to be a round sitting there waiting to go into the chamber. Chamber's that part that is the front part of, or the back part in this case, of the barrel. And so you would take the firearm back like this, and then it would slide forward, and it scrapes that round off and puts it into the chamber, and now it's ready to fire. I chose this firearm because it really is one that we're the most familiar with. This is a 1911 style. It's a .45 caliber, and it's a pretty big round. Sometime if we make another video, we'll talk about all the craziness between calibers and bore and gauges and all this and that. But this one has been around in some form or another since 1911, and it was adopted by the United States for the military. And the difference in it is it actually has a couple of extra features on it. When it's ready to fire like it is now, and there's a round in here, the hammer's already back. And in order to make sure that thing doesn't go off, you have a safety. Revolvers don't have any safety. The way they operate themselves is a safety because the trigger has to be pulled back. They don't need a safety. This, if you just pull the trigger, and it can be very light, the hammer will come forward and the firearm will go off. What it does that's different than this is once the first round goes off, the energy from this, the round and the recoil, as you know, if something goes this way, something also has to go that way, equal force. That recoil pushes this back, and then it loads another round all by itself. It's an auto loader, and it's ready to go. So they can shoot pretty fast. They also have an even trigger pull. You don't have to pull real hard and use your muscular strength to pull the hammer back. And they usually have more capacity in them. This is a single stack. That means it's just one bullet on top of the other. Most of them that have more rounds in them, 15 rounds or something like that, got a little bigger grip on it, and the magazine is staggered. It has a around here, around here, around here, around there. So it's staggered down so it holds more of them. But this one still operates the same. And the thing about these are, as I say, you have a lot more trouble being able to tell if there's a round in there. A lot of them have a little tiny hole up here that if you look in, you can see the round. Never assume that you can see it or not see it. When you pick it up, point it in a safe direction, take the magazine out, and even if there's bullets in the magazine, you think, well, all the bullets are out. Well, rather the rounds are out. There could still be one in here. So always check that too. Always safe direction. Always check that. Okay? And just with that little bit of knowledge, you know something about these firearms. If nothing else, you can ask somebody, have them take you out and show you how to shoot. Don't be afraid to ask people questions. If they belittle you for asking basic questions about something you don't know about, then it's on them. It's like having someone teach you how to ride a bicycle if you've never ridden a bicycle, or drive a car or anything else. It has nothing to do about your innate knowledge. It has to do with what you learn. You have to learn everything. And learn the basics about these. I just showed you this because I know some of you, first time you have a firearm, this just kind of helps tell you the difference. And if you're shopping for one, maybe this will give you a little insight into what you're looking for, and you can ask some more questions to people that know more than I do. But I just wanted to do that because I know there's an awful lot of folks out there that just bought their first firearm. And while it's dangerous to not have one, if you don't have practice and knowledge about the firearm, it can be dangerous for you too. So with a little basic knowledge, you can protect yourself and you can not cause injury to anyone. One of the last things I want to say is if you have children in the house, you got to lock these things up or put them in a completely different place where they can't get to them. Kids are smart about finding things that you don't want them to know about. The very fact that you don't want them to know about, if you remember being a kid, that makes you want to know about it even more. So in some instances, you should lock them up, put trigger guards on them or things like that to prevent them from firing. If you're worried about being able to get to it quickly, there's some gun safes out there that are small, hold one firearm. You put your fingers on them, put a little combination, 1, 3, 2, something like that, and they open right up. Some of the fancy ones read your fingerprint and open up. Failing that, keep the bullets. Now see, I'm doing it. Keep the rounds out of the firearm. Keep them with it, either somewhere where they're not easy to find. Take you a minute to load it, but it might save something if you have children in the house. The nice thing about an automatic in this instance is that you can take the magazine out. You can have a loaded magazine for this. Once again, making sure there's not one in the chamber. And take the magazine and put it someplace else or a little bit away. Because small children too, even if they find the magazine, it's a lot more difficult for them to push this in, right? And then pull this back. Now, if it's a fairly heavy-duty round, 45 or something like that, or 9mm even, it'd be pretty strong to pull this back. And a small child's going to have a hard time doing it. You don't want to count on that. But by doing those things of keeping the magazine away from the firearm or someplace where it has to be placed in it and then actioned, you put another layer of protection there. Revolver, it's probably just a good idea to keep the rounds out of it. They make speed loaders for these that are actually round and fit directly into the chamber. You put your rounds in there, say 6 of them, push them in, turn it, rounds drop in there. So you can still load it pretty fast if you have something like that. And it's worth the safety. I think that's all I have to say, and I hope it helped a little bit. We're going to do one on shotguns here in a little bit too, and it's fun for me, and I hope it makes you guys, want to get into firearms more and find out more about it. Thanks.